Hi everybody, I'm Mike Hogan. Today I'm going to be reading the Poor Prole's Almanac, History of Permaculture, a comprehensive outline of the movement to the present. I was told that I have to read this because it's a scathing critique of fact-filled critique of permaculture, and that I had to respond to this intense critique. And I love it because there's nothing we permaculture people love more than critiquing permaculture. It's our pastime. It's it's what we do when we get together. We critique permaculture. It's our most popular and favorite topic of conversation. So I'm happy to engage with a critique of permaculture. But what is it? Is it a history of permaculture? Is it a critique of permaculture? Is it a critical history of permaculture? I guess we're going to find out. It'd be interesting to have that in the title if that's what it is. So, let's jump right in. The permaculture movement has captured the attention of most folks who find themselves looking for sustainable alternatives to conventional agriculture. Again, right off here, this is our second favorite topic to debate and discuss in permaculture. The fact that permaculture is not an alternative to conventional agriculture. For anybody who's taken the time to read any single book about permaculture or listen to anyone speak about it, it's something we say over and over and over and over again. In fact, Bill Monson, permaculture's founder, would often say, the last thing any of us permaculturists should be doing is any kind of farming. So, permaculture, if you talk to permaculturists about it, would say that it's a much more comprehensive approach to how we create a just and sustainable society in a way that's self-organizing to help regular people make better decisions about the systems that they're using to meet their needs. And so it doesn't just focus on agriculture. So right off the bat, it's making me grumpy, whatever. Part of this attraction comes from its broad strokes ethics, which leave much to interpretation of the end user, as well as capacity to absorb other concepts into this broad system. Okay, so the ethics part, this is the third most popular thing for permaculturists to argue over. We debate the ethics all the time inside the movement. And, so permaculture started with one set of ethics, with the designer's manual. They were developed further. They turned, David Holmgren, when he published Principles and Pathways, came up with a new set of ethics, and then those have been debated and had alternatives and different iterations of them over the time. These days, there's a big critique at the highest levels of the movement that a prescriptive set of ethics might not be the best form of ethics to have. I've critiqued that myself and proposed an alternative ethics. We're always arguing about the ethics. It's what we do. Are the ethics an important part of the popularity of permaculture? I would think that most people, I didn't come to permaculture for the ethics. I came to it because I grew up farming and worked on farms of all different scales, and worked in all different aspects of the field, selling crop insurance and commodities and managing farmers markets, working on farms of all different scales. And I came to it because it presented real and serious alternative approach to how we meet our needs and continue to do things like being involved in food systems in a way that was sustainable and just. So, is this true? You know what? I'm a data guy. I like to look at data. We can quantify this. One way to do it is just to drop them into Google Trends. I put in permaculture ethics and a bunch of other things that people come to permaculture for. I did several different versions of this, and the permaculture ethics were always buried at the bottom. Things like swales, way more popular. Jeff Lawton beats the permaculture ethics. Food forests and forest gardening really trounce the permaculture ethics. Are the permaculture ethics an important part of the popularity of permaculture? I think that we got good data to show that probably not. And the second part of that permaculture absorbs other concepts into it, things like organics, biodynamics, no-till, regenerative grazing, perennial agriculture, agroecology. While they may not define themselves as permaculture practices, permaculture defines them as permaculture practices. This allows for the movement to flourish, pulling in anyone outside the conventional agricultural zeitgeist. again, as a guy who's read like the first chapter in any book on permaculture, I would disagree with this. This is like our fourth most popular thing to argue about in permaculture. You can read, Toby Hemingway or David Holmgren or me or Graham Bell, and all of us point out over and over and over and over and over again that permaculture is not these things. Organic gardening is not permaculture. We say this over and over again. Those things are what they are. Permaculture is some would say, wardrobe that you can organize these things in order to share them with other people as a way to help DIYers find better ways to manage landscapes, manage their wardrobe, manage their houses, and all that other stuff. So we say over and over and over again, permaculture is not this stuff. Permaculture is the box that it's presented in. Hey, let's look at what Bill Monson himself said about this. Here's Bill Monson in his last interview, this is important because permaculture is a field that developed over decades of debate within the field. There's a peer-reviewed journal. There's thousands of PDCs, people teaching together, working together. There's this iterative process that allowed permaculture to develop. What Bill Monson said at the end of his career is very different than what was in Permaculture 1, and Permaculture 2, and Permaculture 3, because permaculture had this process of developing. So here he says, so that's why this last interview is important, because it shows where permaculture arrived. If you're going to critique permaculture of today, not permaculture in 1980. Though somebody's told me that their grandmother practiced permaculture, he makes a joke of that and says, what they mean is that their grandmother grew their own plums and their food and lived a sustainable lifestyle. He says, so did my grandma and so did everybody's grandma. You go back far enough, everybody lived in a sustainable life way. Permaculture, he says, is something entirely different. It has to do with our monetary system and our legal system. It has to do with the efficiency of your housing and your settlement. And your grandma and people who used to live in sustainable life ways never had to deal with all that because they lived in a sustainable system. They didn't have to think about deconstructing the system we have in order to produce something more sustainable. Permaculture fundamentally exists in a historical context. That's one of its primary understandings, that it exists in this context of colonialism and corporatism, divide and conquer, that has broken down our systems. And so what we need to do is repair them. And permaculture is the wardrobe that has a system of tools or sets of tools that help people make that change. That's what permaculture is, not those things. That's what Bill Monson himself said over and over again. Okay, and this next paragraph basically says, okay, so this is going to be a history so we can understand how permaculture became this thing up here. Now, this is, to me, I will admit, if I were reading this alone, I would stop reading right now, because I do not agree with the priors. If you're trying to convince me, or if you're trying to give me a critique of permaculture that I can grow and change permaculture for, then we should start with critiquing permaculture. Oh, look, if permaculture is this thing about farming that's based on some wobbly ethics primarily, and it just absorbs all this other stuff and appropriates it, I'm against that. I'm against that permaculture. We can stop. I agree. We can stop right now. We're done. But luckily, permaculture is not that at all, as we've seen already. And we could, with sources, with some data. So, but hey, a broken clock can be right twice a day. We're going to continue on, because I can't discount all the rest of the critiques in here just because I disagree with this part. That would be a logical fallacy. Okay, so we're going to skip over most of the next part, because what it has is a history of Bill Monson and David Holmgren. I would call these a very biased history of Bill Monson and David Holmgren, with a lot of innuendo and stuff like that. This looks like something to me that could have been written by ChatGPT. In fact, I mean, yeah, and some innuendo and some, appeals to the white supremacy and stuff like that. And it's not too much different than this. Here's kind of an unethical way of arguing and building a case. You present something with a lot of facts. It's easy to just compile the facts these days. Like I said, you can do it with Chat GPT. It doesn't appear to me, it looks like a lot of the stuff from the text was kind of cherry picked out. It doesn't really give a comprehensive view in any way of those texts. A lot of like the quotes and things are kind of cherry picked and taken out of context in a lot of the cases. And then there's just like a lot of insinuation that you have a fact, though, some of it's facts, and you follow the fact with something that's not credible that you just made up. And it makes it seem like the thing you just made up is also a fact because it was followed by a fact, right? And by the way, if you look at some of these citations in here and actually go to them, it's not clear that they're easily supported by those texts. We'll get to that. So take a look at this. The impetus for the movement, however, was fed by the same eagerness that drove the Back to the Land movement, the Odoms, and the developing white supremacy movement in the oil crisis struck. This is called the guilt by association fallacy. Also, this is like a hypothesis, it's an analysis, it's an opinion. It's not supported at all, but this is a guilt by association fallacy, just mentioning white supremacy in here. This, I can't do much with that. So Holmgren, in the meantime, had connected with this other guy, and it points out they have some meeting. There's some noxious weed things going on. This person, the author, refers to them as invasive. This might be problematic or not. And then he claims this use of invasive species is what drew Holmgren in. Holmgren was just excited, as a guy with a PhD in ecology, to jump on board with using invasive species. And this is why Holmgren became interested in working with this other guy. Oh, for one, I would consider this an ad hominem. Again, people can be wrong about something and still create very valuable pieces of work. And just critiquing somebody based on their authority and saying that they had one bad idea over here and saying all these other ideas are wrong because they had this other bad idea about species or whatever is a fallacious appeal to authority. It's an ad hominem attack. It doesn't critique permaculture. It critiques one idea that maybe this guy had, but it actually doesn't even source this. I don't know if this is true. I would love to see this actually supported in a credible way. But even if it was, it wouldn't really have much of a bearing on my opinion about permaculture as a field or its value. Oh, so there are lots of insinuations like that. Yeah, reading through those bios of David Holmgren and Bill Monson, he takes every opportunity to also get in their opinions and about their character. Again, I don't know if it's relevant. Fallacious appeals to authority, ad hominem attacks. They don't do much. Those aren't a critique. An ad hominem attack is not a critique. I can't do anything with it to improve permaculture. So this part was interesting. This is actually something a little more substantive. He actually addresses the pattern language idea, which a lot of times critics of permaculture never even bother to try to understand it. And in this, he does not actually really talk about the main purpose, the main thing, the main goal for what a pattern language is, and why a pattern language was chosen as the tool, as the primary pulpit for permaculture and its primary tool. And that was because Christopher Alexander was this actually, I think, maybe has it slightly backwards, and it says his ideas thrived in software development. It may have been the other way around. To some extent, he was actually what Christopher Alexander was tasked with was improving the architectural outcomes primarily of DIYers and people across interdisciplinary fields. So that you can learn a thing like having a better garden without getting a PhD in horticulture. And if we're talking about permaculture as creating a just and sustainable society, then you don't have to have PhDs in every single field relevant to having a just and sustainable society. You don't have have 800,000 lives on this planet, and you only have finite time. Think about it this way. You want to remodel your living room, and you have finite time. Which would you rather have? To spend like 4 hours with? Would you rather have a big stack of scientific studies on everything about the comparative sustainability of bamboo flooring versus carpeting, and how wall colors affect your mood and furniture arrangements and every factor relevant to creating your living room? Or would you like to have all of that research and best practice synthesized into a short book that had design ideas that you could, with pictures that would inspire you, that you could easily replicate in order to design and choose your living room? The scientific studies are not the right tool for that job. They were not designed for that job. The scientific studies were designed to increase the understanding for professionals within that field. The book over here that synthesizes all those things for a DIYer, that's the right tool for the job. That's what Christopher Alexander was trying to create, and that's what permaculture wanted to be, was exactly that. A set of resources to help DIYers and home gardeners and farmers and whatever better do what they wanted to do without having to become experts in all those different fields. Instead, the experts can work together, make the pattern language, and improve outcomes. This completely misses that whole point and does not even address it. Thus, kind of again, another straw man misrepresenting the whole context and point of this within here. He goes on to say something about how he did not have to work within a physical limitation that is guided by history, colonization, and so on, and did not have to address wrongs within code that comes with the challenge of a world where individuals have been displaced globally. This could be a valuable critique of permaculture. And again, he goes on to develop that critique, except it misses a whole history of this being discussed in the permaculture texts. That permaculture itself can be seen as, if you read the permaculture texts, as a process as the quote from Bill Monson, your grandmother never had to worry about a decolonized world. Permaculture exists in that historical context. So this, to me, this is at least worth debating, this right here. I would love to see this critique developed in a way by people who are knowledgeable about permaculture, who are actually coming to it from an honest perspective, instead of just kind of writing a hit piece like this. Come on, this is a hit piece. Then that would be really interesting. Unfortunately, he does not attempt to support that assertion at all. He just throws it out there as a hypothesis and does not even attempt to support that hypothesis in any way. As a critique, there's not much I can do with that. He does not attempt, it's not a critique, it's a hypothesis. Here he talks about the Odoms, implies they're white supremacists. Again, a fallacious appeal to authority and ad hominem attack then says that it's similar in the same way. It lacks a historical context. Okay, finally, I've read through this big long piece to finally get to the critique, to the fundamental critique here. So it appears now, to me in retrospect, I could have used some signposts. I could have, this is not really a history of permaculture. It's a weird piece building up these few critiques. It doesn't support these critiques again, but does throw them out there. So it's a set of unsupported hypotheses is how I would say this. There's no data. There's no supporting points for these critiques. So that would be my critique of this critique. It's not a critique. It's a list of unsupported statements. A lot of them would be very difficult to actually support. But here's the thing. So this fundamental problem of permaculture lacking historical context, that's part one, and permaculture lacks an iterative process. By the way, what the heck is an iterative process? It means a process through which different versions, different iterations are created to improve a thing over time. You have like Permaculture 1.0, you test it and come up and make it better, and have Permaculture 2.0 and Permaculture 3.0. It means that the ideas improve and change over time. For example, he says that scientific practices, Western and indigenous, I'm glad he includes indigenous in here at least, are framed within an iterative process, whether through a scientific process or through the evolution in an indigenous society. Every year they try something and maybe tweak it and improve it. It gets better over time. There's an iterative process. Major point right here in permaculture. Permaculturists look at how to apply the method, permaculture is not a method, to the world, instead of asking which aspects of permaculture are helping and how they can be totally changed or even eliminated as contexts move, and how they basically, he's saying permaculture is this monolith carved in stone by Bill Monson in his own bare hands back in the day, and it remains as Bill Monson created it today. And we impose that on the world just as we did back then. This is bunk. Even in this, before I even got to this claim, we've already looked at several different versions of iterative processes in permaculture. We talked about how the ethics developed early on, how permaculture when it started didn't even have ethics. And then it was decided that permaculture needed an ethics based on some writing that Bill Monson had encountered. The original ethics were then changed and adapted by David Holmgren because they were found to not be very easily communicated. Then the ethics have been changed 1,000,000 times since then. There's all different versions of it. And even today, we continue to debate the permaculture ethics over and over and over again. So the permaculture ethics are just one example of permaculture having a very robust iterative process. Another thing is that pattern language thing. When permaculture first started, Bill Monson and David Holmgren didn't realize that that was the best tool. The Permaculture 1 and Permaculture 2 were created much more like how-to books. Then a pattern language was written, they encountered it, and it became very clear, a pattern language is the best tool for this. As permaculture has continued to develop, authors like myself, Toby Hemingway, Peter Bain with the Permaculture Handbook have all taken that idea and created new iterations of permaculture, new text using that same tool. So again, another great example of a great iterative process in permaculture. Permaculture even had a peer-reviewed journal, as we said back in the day, and a lot of these concepts were debated over time. Permaculture changed over time. In this, there's a really, really funny thing. He admits in this article that permaculture has an iterative process. He points out that Bill Monson changed what he said about things over time. Now, he characterizes that as a character flaw, as though Bill Monson was shifty. He said one thing in 1980, a different thing in 2002, because he was shifty. They made that like a character. That's the iterative process. Bill Monson's ideas changed and developed over time. He acknowledges that and characterizes it as a character flaw when it's the iterative process. It's there. But the iterative process in permaculture goes far beyond this. Because permaculture is a pattern language-based design system. And most of the patterns that are most common in use in the real world come from science, come from research-backed things. I've done videos before on the top 10 techniques that most real people use in permaculture gardens in the real world. They're all research-based things with like a big literature backing them up. And it changes over time. When one thing is found to be false, then it changes. And we see that in the permaculture literature. He mentions in here too, biodynamic accumulators is a thing. There are older permaculture texts that mention dynamic accumulators. This was an idea. I don't want to bore you if you're not familiar with it. This was found to be questioned. It was a model that came up against academic scrutiny, and so most permaculturists abandoned using it because iterative process. And now today, there's a little bit more kind of a return to it because scientists have begun using the term dynamic scavengers. and dynamic nutrient scavengers. Instead of it being dynamic nutrient accumulators, the scientific community is now using dynamic nutrient scavengers, but they're including the same plant list that used to be on permaculture dynamic accumulator plant list in a lot of cases. Iterative process, and permaculture is responsive to it. Again, it's a real disappointment that the only critiques here are not supported. They are thrown out there and assumed to be correct without going about trying to even support these arguments. And that's a shame, but to be honest, as we've seen, it'd be really difficult to support the claim that permaculture lacks an iterative process, because we see in practice a robust iterative process again and again and again, examples in the real world. Does permaculture lack a historical context? The historical context has been one of the biggest topics of discussion within permaculture. Whether or not that discussion is true and accurate, and whether or not it's helpful, could be a whole topic for debate that could be actually very interesting. He doesn't do that work. There's no critique here. There's no critique. There's an assertion that is not supported in any way. I can't do anything with that. That's not useful to me at all as a critique. Okay, so that brings us to the last and final critique in the piece, which is which we kind of skipped over before, which is about the relationship between permaculture today and indigenous rights and sovereignty and tech and things like that, which is traditional ecological knowledge and appropriation. And he starts by outlining some of the current debates in the permaculture movement about this and the arguments we're having. And that's where he quotes me, one of my critiques of permaculture. That's it. That's the thing. See, that's us having the iterative process. That's how you do an iterative process. You offer actually substantive critiques of the thing, and you argue about it, and you debate it, and you figure out which one is going to win out as permaculture moves on to the future. That's how you do the thing. That's how you do it. He doesn't really offer anything new on that. Instead, he moves on to claim the argument that Bill Monson gives credit to the Aborigines at the beginning of his books isn't backed by any evidence. There's no evidence. There's no evidence that Bill Monson gives claim to Aboriginal peoples in the beginning of his books, except then he goes on to say that at least 4 times in like Permaculture 1 and in Permaculture 2, he does it again. And so there's some evidence. There's some evidence in those. And then he completely doesn't talk about the Permaculture Designer's Manual. When you pick up the Permaculture Designer's Manual, it has this thing on it. And then you are invited, which is an Aboriginal symbol, and then you are invited to read the cover story about it. It's one of the first things that you do when you interact with the Permaculture Designer's Manual. The great oval of the design represents the egg of life, the quality of which cannot be created or destroyed, but from within which all things live are expressed. Within the egg coiled the rainbow snake, the earth shaper of Australian and American Aboriginal peoples. Beginning by citing and sourcing permaculture in the very beginning of the book to Aboriginal people and Aboriginal ideas. When it comes to some of the most important parts of the permaculture design process and permaculture principles, he says for every scientific statement articulated on energy, the Aboriginal tribes, people of Australia, have an equivalent statement of life. Life, they say, is totality, neither created nor destroyed. It can be imagined as an egg from which all the tribe's life form issue, which is the thing on the cover. And what's considered the thesis paragraph of the designer's manual, he continues, I believe that unless we adopt sophisticated Aboriginal belief systems and learn respect for all life, then we lose our own, not only as lifetime, but also any future opportunity to evolve our potential. Again, continuously giving this credit where due to Aboriginal peoples, and even starting the books and putting that concept right into the thesis paragraph of the designer's manual. Was that there as much in Permaculture 1 and Permaculture 2? They were there, but not to this extent. That's the iterative process. Permaculture evolved and grew. Today, in 2024, when you take PDC, I would bet most people that take PDCs, especially like in the United States, PDCs are begun with pointing out what the tribe was in the area where you're doing your PDC. It's a common thing. There's a lot of deference and a lot of support for indigenous rights, indigenous sovereignty, indigenous communities, indigenous history within permaculture today. It's the iterative process to judge permaculture by what's in Permaculture 1 and not even mention the best evidence, which is in the designer's manual, to me is cherry picking. To me it strikes me as very dishonest to judge permaculture and only present evidence from what's in Permaculture 1. If you're reading this, you want to critique permaculture, get involved in a critique of permaculture. You can do that by taking an allegation, taking something that you want to say about it, learn about it first. The first step in understanding and critiquing a thing is to understand it, understand the history of thought within it. That has not been done here. There's no look at how permaculture, the iterative process of permaculture in regards to the ethics, in regards to a pattern language. In fact, he claims there isn't even an iterative process. Okay, there we have it. That's it. That's what we got. And if you watch this far, I'm kind of sorry, because I feel like I wished there had been a critique in this critical history of permaculture that we could learn from and grow from and utilize. And there was not, that I could identify, a single supported argument or critique of permaculture in this piece. So, yeah.